Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. This is Ryan Honeyman, and I'm a partner at Lift Economy. My guest today is Alli Myatt. And Alli is the co-founder of The Equity Practice, a racial equity consulting firm that supports organizations to infuse liberatory principles into their talent practices so everyone can thrive. Alli has over 2 decades of experience advising over 150 teams and organizations to reimagine their work practices. She has studied organizational development, racial equity, human connection and belonging, and is certified in several restorative practices. Alli has been published in the Harvard Business Review and has been featured as a speaker at South by Southwest and in Diversity Women magazine. She has worked at Bridgespan Group, Teach for America, and other nonprofits, and holds a bachelor's degree from Cornell and an MBA from the Wharton School of Business. Alli, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Before we maybe drop into some of the deeper questions, there's a lot going on in the world right now. And just on a human level, how are you doing right now with everything? How are you feeling? How are you doing? How's, your emotional status?
Yeah. Wow. That's a big question just because there is so much going on in the world. I try and stay really present and remind myself that I have everything that I need at this current moment. But when I sort of zoom out, it's really hard. I live in Texas. It's a really hard time to be in Texas. I'm from Texas originally. And I was actually at a mall when the Allen shooting happened. And so I'm always very aware that I'm in an environment there's a lot of violence in my community and not a lot of connection. And so sometimes I can feel hopeless and worried about the world. And that's why I try and stay present, because it's like at this moment, I'm connected and I'm good. But I know there's a lot of pain in the world and people are in a lot of pain. So it's something I think about a lot. So that's where I am emotionally. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for presencing that. And, maybe some of the story to kind of how you got to where you are, you can maybe touch on some of these pieces around being from Texas, et cetera. And so could you tell us a bit about your background and how you first got interested in the work you're doing today?
Yeah, I grew up in Houston in predominantly white communities and went to predominantly white schools. And what that meant for me as a Black kid growing up was that I was very aware that I was another, very aware that my life and the way that I had to navigate the world was different than my peers. And I think my first memory of that was when I was 6. I really, really wanted to read a book by Beverly Cleary, obsessed with Beverly Cleary. And so I asked my teacher, Mrs. Doyle, if I could go to the section of the library with the books without pictures. And she said, no, we were in the library. And I remember she took me by my shoulders and sort of turns me around and pushes me towards the picture book section where the other Black kids were. And I remember seeing that the white kids were over in the section that I wanted to go to. And I remember being confused by that. And I remember seeing other things like that and even having a conversation with my friend Allison, who is also Black, about, we'd been going to school together with these white kids since we were 3. And we were confused why we were being treated differently. And so my parents helped me navigate that. They would advocate on my behalf and come up to the school, talk to teachers, talk to the principals, took something to the superintendent once, and would advocate on my behalf so that I would get access to the resources that I needed. And they taught me to advocate for myself. And I know without their intervention, I don't even know what that would have meant for my trajectory. But those experiences, those very early experiences, made me able to build relationships cross-racially and made me very curious about how the world got like this. Like, why does systemic racism exist? And so a lot of times when I could in school, I would study that and learn more about the history of racism in our country. And I think that that carries through the work that I do now, because I've always been curious about that. And then also curious about how do we connect and how do we disrupt that. So yeah, very early.
Thank you. And so did you sort of have, before starting the equity practice, did you sort of like work in the field, or like how did you sort of build up the skills and experience to really launch that?
I've worked in human capital for most of my career, at least since grad school. And so my last job before starting this, I was a COO. I was in charge of our talent, planning, strategy, ops, finance, everything, right? And part of my work was doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work. I had our strategy. I owned our whole strategy. And I learned so much from that experience about how to change how power moved within an organization so that you could have more equitable and inclusive outcomes, that you could have a more diverse team that could thrive. And it was really powerful work because we started with helping people to understand the role that identity plays in our ability to thrive at work, and how we see people, how people see us, and how patterns of oppression show up in our organization. And it was really powerful because it changed how people thought about what was possible at work. People would say, like, this changed my life. This changed how I see myself. And so I knew I wanted to do this after I worked for an organization. I was like, oh, I want to do my own thing next. And so about 3 years ago, we started the equity practice with the intention of really focusing on the talent side of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, so that we could take what we learned from the previous experience and apply it to other organizations.
And just noticing, like, you know, as a person of color, you were like tasked with being the CEO, and the DEI stuff was just sort of like smashed under your duties. Does it sound like? Or it's like...
Right. I mean, when I was leaving, so I worked at Teach for America before that job. And when I was leaving Teach for America, I really wanted to do DEI work, because at Teach for America, I got exposed to a new way of approaching DEI. So DEI has existed for decades in different iterations, and I've participated in that even starting in high school. So a lot of access programs are like early forms of DEI. And what I had learned in my career earlier was that, oh, if we could just train people of color how to navigate these systems, then that's okay, right? Like, so it puts the extra work on people of color to disrupt. What Teach for America did was completely flip that. They were like, actually, the system's broken and we need to fix the system instead of asking people of color to have this extra labor at work. And so I was like, it was so eye-opening for me, because when you teach people that they have to like overcome a system, you internalize that a lot, that there's something wrong with you. And like, I internalized that a lot. And now that I have the knowledge that I have that started at Teach for America, I can see the patterns of oppression and the experiences, and I have a whole new understanding of what was actually going on. And it's been helpful for me. So I knew I wanted to do that kind of work somewhere. But yes, the COO role had a lot of things under it. and some might argue, you know, as a Black woman, one of the forms of anti-Blackness that shows up in our organizations is we ask the Black women to do a lot of labor, and that was definitely true. So yeah, it was a lot. I learned a lot. I learned about how power reacts to this type of work and tries to push back in like very secretive ways. It tries to push back and stop the work from advancing. But yes, I had a lot on my plate for sure.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned starting to work in the equity practice. And so what are some of the like focus areas, or, you know, could you give folks a little overview of the types of things you do and how you help companies?
Yeah, we really love helping organizations to think about the talent side of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what we mean by that is everything an employee experiences, from the moment they get recruited to onboarded, to how you pay people, how performance management happens, how project management happens, how career advancement happens, all of those things, how you can change those practices so that everyone can thrive. And so we do a lot of different things to help people with that. Some of the things that we do include training people around some of those practices, or we have some training around some of the mindset work that folks have to do that. And then we also do consulting, which is just supporting and advising people to make those changes. One thing that I'm really passionate about that we also do is restorative work. I see this work as restorative. And what I mean by restorative work, it's whenever there's been a harm that happens, it helps people to talk about what happened between them and decide if we want to stay in relationship together, what is needed to move forward? What do we need to do so that we can stay in relationship? And I love restorative work. I think because for me, it's been so critical as part of the DEI work, that as power fights back, right? Sometimes harm happened to me, and restorative work helped me to stay in the work. And so I think like when you think about DEI work, we're really trying to address a harm that's happened and that our humanity has sort of been removed from the workplace. And so we have these oppressive practices that are causing harm. And so how do we restore our humanity back into our workplaces so that we can repair this thing that's broken between us collectively? So we do that as well.
Yeah, I'd love if you could maybe dive in a little deeper on like what's an example or some restorative practices that you do that have sort of been effective. Yeah.
Yeah. So I love facilitating restorative conversations between people. I know that some people hate this, like something has happened and they call it restorative circles. It borrows from circle practices that exist in Africa, New Zealand, indigenous communities here in the Americas. And really what it is it's use a circle. If you think about it, every point around a circle is equidistant from the center. And so when you're doing circle practice, you're sharing space in that way where you're equidistant. Nobody's voice is more important than anybody else's. And so I facilitate conversations like that, but I try and do it in a more power aware way. So even though we're in circle together, there are power differences, right? So we're not actually in circle. So how I try and adjust how I facilitate that so that everyone gets heard. And I use tools like slowing down the process, a lot of reflection. I tell participants that that's a dynamic that can happen, and I name it when I see it to support people so that we can make sure that everyone gets the repair they need when harm has happened. And I also try and elevate the conditions that made the harm possible to happen. So if there's someone that's managing in a way with a lot of microaggressions, or there's been some sort of instance, yes, that's an interpersonal thing, but there's like organizational conditions that allowed that harm to happen. And I try and elevate that for organizations to be like, hey, you might want to think about this condition, and here's some ideas that you can implement to disrupt that. So I try and do that as well.
Yeah, I was like wanting to snap on the, organizational conditions piece. Because,
yes,
I've often talked with folks who are like, hey, we want to be more diverse and inclusive. And they're like, how do we hire more people of color? But usually they don't understand that, maybe it's like several years of like, what is keeping folks of color already like away? Like, how are we not even seeing what we're already doing so that when we hire folks in, there's like a sense of like belonging and inclusion? Can you speak to that piece of like the work that's required even before hiring on the talent side?
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about it like it's like a bucket with holes in it, and you're pouring diversity in at the top, and then all the exclusive and oppressive practices are like letting diversity fall out of the bucket. So you don't actually retain people who your diverse talent. You have what you see in the outcomes for organizations is that you'll see retention rates are different for people of color and women sometimes, and other marginalized identities. You'll see progression, so career advancement will be different, compensation's different, all of those things. And so if you really want to move from a monoculture or like a homogenous culture to one that is more open to many different people, you do have to change how you operate, because the way your organization is set up is for the success of the dominant culture in that. And it could be as simple as professionalism. Like, what does that mean? Like, a lot of times in our dress codes, when you read about women's hair and how it's supposed to look, it doesn't look like my hair, right? And it's sort of like this, and this might seem like a simple thing, but people get held back for rules and regulations that are written for the dominant culture and are not thinking about the many different ways that we all show up and are different culturally, and still excellent, right? And still can do phenomenal work, but it just shows up differently. And so making sure that your practices and policies allow for everyone to thrive in the very different ways that we do that is really important if you want a diverse team.
And I'm curious as well, it's mentioned in your bio, and I know that, and sort of researching you and the work you do is like connecting to this larger sense of belonging. And I know that sometimes white folks, like, we can be so like, what do we have to do right? And like, it's like this, we sort of get in our own heads and like, we don't want to make a mistake, but then we just end up taking a step back. And like, I think it's really critical for like white folks and honestly everyone to know like it's about belonging and like making more of a culture of like love and connection. So there's not like this, it's not like we're giving something up, or like it's sort of like framed as like, here's all the ways that you're being oppressive. I mean, there are ways to identify, but it's also like the bigger picture is like, this is actually a better way for us to like connected to love and belonging. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that and like how it shows up in your work.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that resonates a lot. There's a lot of thinkers that talk about how oppression affects not just those being oppressed, but those who are doing the oppressing. Like, I don't know, if for those of people out there that are Harry Potter fans, it's like the Horcrux, right? Like, if you're doing this very harmful thing, it like destroys your soul. But I think for me, this operating in a more liberatory way is a practice. I was not brought up to operate this way. None of us are. And so we're all kind of learned. That's what I think helps me when I'm thinking about working cross-culturally and how we build belonging, is that recognizing that it's a practice and being open to messing up, right? Like, it's like when I played clarinet growing up and played piano, and you had to learn how to play. You have to learn how to hold your hands, and you're going to play a note wrong occasionally, and you just go back and try again. And I think the more, for me anyway, that I can orient towards the idea that this is a practice, that I'm invested in another human being's humanity, and that it's okay. We're going to be accountable together, right? Like, if harm happens, we're going to be accountable for that. But how do I both be open to being held accountable for when I've caused harm, and how do I hold the other person accountable in a way that sees their humanity, so that we're staying in relationship together? I don't know. I just think it's I like my work of relationships better when I operate that way, when I'm really invested in being in reciprocal relationship with people. I just think it feels better. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that you do better work that way. Trying just to, how can we be better together is just how I try and think about it.
You mentioned liberatory practices. Could you just like talk about that and what that means for folks who might not know that word? Or
Yeah. And I think there's probably a lot of different definitions for that. And so for me, what I think about liberatory practices are the antidote to the extractive practices that we see in businesses. And so a lot of our businesses were sort of created on top of practices that literally intended to extract value from people and tend to act in transactional ways with people. And I think that's why if you're trying to extract from someone, that is the antithesis of equity and inclusion in my mind. And so if you want equity, inclusion, justice, liberation, you have to operate in more reciprocal ways with people. You're sharing power. There's this idea of self-determination of like, how do we allow for many ways of being at organizations? How do we act in solidarity? So how do I think about my power and privilege and how I use it to support others? And then practicing what we call abundant care. So caring for each other, being invested in each other, making sure that people have time for rest, that they're comforted. All these things, like to me, are part of liberation, so that we can have more autonomy and freedom in what we're creating through work, is what I'm talking about. There's so many different frameworks. I'm sure like if folks Google liberatory practices, you'll get to see so many different thinkers, but that's how I think about it. It's like the relationship and power and how we use it together in a nutshell.
Yeah. One liberatory practice I want to like go in on that you mentioned, which is often not necessarily what folks think about when they think about this, is rest, relaxation, restoration. And can you speak about how that shows up and how important it is? Because, like we started off this call talking about, like there's so many challenges and so much pain. There's this maybe a desire to just like go at everything and give 110%, but it's not possible, right? So curious for.
So for me, there's like so many Black feminists that I learned from here. One, Trisha Hershey's book, if you've read it, Rest is Resistance, is amazing. And she talks about rest being a way to disrupt capitalism and white supremacy culture and all these oppressive practices. It's like, it's literally, and for me in my own journey, it's been, I work less as a form of how do I undo all these internalized oppressive things. We're not machines. We're supposed to rest because we're human beings. And I think rest is about like taking care of yourself and disrupting the harmful effects of capitalism. I also really admire Harriet Tubman's story, and she's such an inspiration for me in my own journey towards liberation. There was the story of her before she escaped to freedom. She had this dream. She used to have visions because she got hit in the head with a very large weight. An overseer threw a weight towards her head, and it caused a head injury. And so she was actually disabled for the rest of her life, and saw visions that inspired her to go to freedom and to help others to find their way to freedom. And in this dream that she had, she dreamed of flying to freedom. She's flying over the farmlands, and she can see where she's headed, and she starts to feel tired in the dream, and she realizes, I'm not going to make it. And so she falls down to the earth. She's devastated because she didn't make it to freedom. And then all these women dressed in white come and take her and carry her across. And when you think about even her story, she got shelter, comfort, food, care. People showed her the way. And I think like for me, that care that was provided to her is so necessary if we are to get to freedom. I think liberation is a collective act. It is not something that you can do on your own, because when you think about people being autonomous and free, sometimes those things conflict, right? Like what you want to do might conflict with what I want to do. And so how do we navigate that together? How do we find our way together? And so care and rest is part of that, I think, at least the way I think about it.
Oh, 110%. I mean, I think it's like one of the hardest things for us to do who are trying to do this work is just stop and take a bath or like listen to some dance music.
Yes. Oh, it's so important though, because it's like there's even research like even beyond like the idea of like we're not machines and there's more to us than labor. But even when you are looking at labor, there's like a lot of research that says we shouldn't be working 40 hours a week. That 40 hours a week is like an arbitrary number that somebody made up. And having been the person that's made up numbers before, I can totally see how that happened. And then you're like, wait, how did this become a thing that I made up? But like they thought in the 30s that the changes in technology would allow us to work like 20 hours a week, which is what they say is probably a more reasonable amount that we should be working. And so it's funny, we actually probably could work 20 hours a week, but instead of working less, we've decided to not take the productivity increases and do that for, I think greed and extraction. But it's not necessary to work as much as we do, and the work is better if you don't. So
yeah, it's so funny. There's like this principle in like energy where like if you have like solar panels or things and it's more efficient, you end up using more energy, even though it's like more efficient. And I feel like maybe similar to like productivity tools. It's like, oh, I'll just like do this tool and then be more efficient, but then you just fill it up with like more work,
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So it's very conscious. Right. I feel like what you're saying is like, you have to really decide, I'm not going to do this as a liberatory practice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard, right? Like I work for myself, and I still sometimes feel guilty. I'm like, oh, I'm not doing enough. I'm like, whenever that happens, I'm like, where is that coming from? And it's from, all these ways that we're indoctrinated with this idea that we're supposed to, like, the way we get value in the world is what labor we put out there, which is just so messed up. Like I believe we're valuable as human beings because we are, like, just because we exist, and I don't think it's about like what you do. It's about the being. We're human beings, right? So
you started the company 3 years ago, and
yes,
as you've written about, and I think folks have noticed, like this sort of like DEI justice summer of like 2020 has now stalled out with like the big commitments.
Yeah.
What do you think is causing that, or what are you seeing? Because you work in this space day to day. Like, what are you seeing with companies and some of the stalled progress?
Yeah. I mean, it's predictable. MLK said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And what I think he meant by that is that this is long work. You don't get there overnight. And so, we're all kind of pushing the arc towards justice. And it's predictable when you look at like these movements through the centuries. Whenever you make an advancement, there's going to be contraction. And so I think this is something and we made such like that. The summer of 2020 was the first time I ever remember in my life witnessing people listen who had not listened before. And I think it was because we had slowed down because of the pandemic, and you had to, because we couldn't distract ourselves with the busyness of life. Life had slowed down, and here you have this community of which I'm a part, because I remember the distress and despair that I felt just 3 years ago. And it was the first time that I remember being paid attention to in my whole life. And so that's a big step forward. And so we're seeing a step back. I think these anti-CRT, all these like laws scared people, right? Like there's pushback. Like, as I mentioned, one of the things I learned in our DEI work was that power pushes back when disrupted. And so power is pushing back. It's been disappointing to see people who put up the black boxes and say that their allies cower in the corner, right? That they're scared of that pushback, because that's when we need our allies to sort of step up and provide cover. Because imagine if you're scared of the pushback, imagine what it's like to be a marginalized person living in Texas and witnessing the pushback and realizing that this could mean, like, I think about this often about like, oh gosh, if the laws go, there will be a point when the laws revert and I might have to leave, like literally leave the place that I grew up in, because it's not safe for me to live in anymore. And so I hope that people will realize that this is part of the journey, the ebb and flow of it, and that if we all continue to work together and push forward, we have the power we need to continue to progress forward. The arc doesn't bend if we don't bend it. So I don't know. That's kind of how I think about it, is that I still have hope that people, even though we're seeing a contraction in the work and the focus on the work, that I think it's just people are either scared or just, it's hard, right? Like, it's hard. I think a lot of people thought, oh, I'll just read some books and take some training and then poof, racism goes away. Well, guess what? It's been here for 5 centuries, at least this form of it. And so it's like, it's going to take a little bit longer than a book or a book group to actually make progress. And I hope people will come back to the work, even though they're taking a step away right now.
And I've talked about it with some colleagues and friends, and it does seem like there's an element, like I personally was, like the way that I dealt with a lot of racial justice was sort of like angry at all white people and like angry at myself and like angry at my family, like you're not doing enough. And like, I do feel like there's an element of like this anti-CRT, like anti-woke, like the whole like right-wing piece. There's some element deep down of like, it's like they're feeling like we're not actually being included. There's no like their sense of belonging isn't part of like this future. And so I do wonder like what I would, and maybe that's part of like, Martin Luther King, you mentioned, I've always been like, is love really the best way to like move people's minds and like shift hearts and minds? Like, doesn't it, like there's like Malcolm's pretty appealing in like his approach, right?
Yeah.
But like I've always felt like there is some element of, if we're just like canceling all people who are like right wing, or like we're canceling everyone and like you just can't be a participant, like we're gonna get the pushback from folks. And so I'm like, how do I in my work bring that love and belonging? Because it does feel like, as much as I don't agree that like this is like woke and CRT, there's like some element of truth of like we need to be more inclusive and like belonging towards those folks as well.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot in there, because like I think when you think about the arc of the moral universe bending, you needed Malcolm and Martin. You know what I mean? You need Frederick Douglass and you need Harriet Tubman. You need all these different people pushing in different ways to move forward, I think. And so I think like each of us has a ministry, as we say in the Black community. It's like, this is my ministry or this is not my ministry. And so like, I think there is work to be done to make sure everyone realizes this is our collective work. I take a lot of inspiration from John A. Powell's work around targeted universalism. Yeah, because it's like this idea of like none of us are being served by this crap. And so like, how do we change it so it works for all of us? That I think can be really powerful. And it's been interesting to see the examples of that framework of how, if you sort of talk about how we're going to, recognizing that we all need different things as we fix a system or a process, but we're fixing it so that we all can thrive, I think can be helpful. And then I've found helpful in my work, people calm down when they realize I'm working at it too, right? There's something about, as a Black woman, I think sometimes people think I'm going to come in there and be like, down with whatever, like you're doing it wrong or whatever. And I'm actually, no, I'm undoing this too. My work is different than your work, right? But I'm doing the work to undo these things for myself too, and to stop participating in these things too. And I think that helps people to realize that like we truly are all in it together. And I'm invested in a world where we do all thrive. Like, I don't think you get to a safe place where there's anyone that feels like they don't belong. That's just not a safe community to live in, I don't think.
Kind of shifting a little, is there anything that you're most excited about right now? Like what's getting you up in the morning? Like, oh, I'm so excited to work on XYZ or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, the restorative work is really something I really love. And people keep asking us to help them work on how do I navigate conflict? How do I give feedback? All these things that, like, how do I talk to people at work? And it's fascinating because I think it is restorative work, which is really relationship work. My hypothesis is that the reason why people can't give feedback or navigate conflict is because they don't have a reciprocal relationship at work. They have a transactional one. And it's fascinating when I talk about relationships at work. People are like, I don't have a relationship with my colleagues and I don't want one. And I'm like, you always have a relationship with your colleagues. It might be transactional and shallow. And I understand why sometimes people resist having a deeper relationship because there are microaggressions. People can't be authentic. As a person of color, it might not feel safe. I get that. And when I say relationships at work, I'm not talking about we need to be friends or hang out and have a beer. It's how do we have a work appropriate relationship where I'm invested in your liberation, I'm invested in being reciprocal with you, I'm invested in your growth and learning, and how do we build a relationship around that? And that requires some vulnerability. Sorry, America. But like you do need to be vulnerable if you want to live want to be in a work environment where psychological safety exists, you need vulnerability. If you want collective liberation, you need vulnerability. And so I'm really excited about how we can support our clients to embrace that more and to do more intentional relationship building and having relationship building rituals at work that help build work appropriate intimacy so that we can be liberated together. That's something I'm really excited to think about. And I think about it a lot. Do a lot of reading and trying to figure out like how we create communities of care in our organizations.
Do you do anything with nonviolent communication when you're training?
Yes. So I took a wonderful training, Decolonizing Nonviolent Communication from Minachi last year, which has influenced how I do restorative circles now. It has helped me a lot in my personal relationships, particularly with my parents, and understanding like needs, like at the core. A lot of times our needs are not being met, and then we do weird stuff when our needs aren't being met. And if I can understand the other person's needs better, then I feel like it creates more empathy. And I really like the way that Minanchi did the class because I think a lot of these tools sometimes are like power agnostic, as if we all have the same amount of power. That's not true. And so they did the class in a more somatic and power aware way, which is really helpful for me.
That's awesome. One or two people on my team have taken their class, and I've also heard that's a really good reframe of NVC. Yes. So shout out.
Yeah. Yes. They're amazing. Minachi's awesome.
Cool. Let's see. What's next for your work and the equity practice, the next 5 or 10 years? I don't know if it's possible to think that far out.
Oh gosh.
The next 12 months.
Let's see if we survive this contraction of the DEI work. Let's see if we still exist. That's like the big focus. I think like the thing I'm most excited about is this restorative practice. A couple of weeks ago, one of my former colleagues reached out because they're thinking about doing a restorative approach to some of the programmatic work. And so I was explaining how I got trained and like how I do restorative work. And they're like, well, can you just train us in the way that you do it? Because I've modified what I've learned along the way. And I was like, I never really thought about this thing that I love and that I can do with a lot of ease. I was like, oh, maybe we should do a training on some of these modified facilitation techniques. So we're hoping to do that in the fall. So if folks want to learn how to do restorative work and facilitate restorative conversations in a work setting, sign up for our newsletter because we'll be announcing that hopefully if we can get that rolling. But I'm excited about that. Like I'm really we're focusing more on relationship building and restoration in the ways that we do our work, which is just really inspiring for me. And I love it. I get a lot of joy out of helping people to find each other and understand each other and see each other's humanity. And then from there, create a new world together. I think that's just really inspiring.
And what about, one thing we ask guests is like, what do you need right now? And how can the listeners help you grow this next economy?
Yeah, definitely we need, like, this contraction is a scary time for a lot of people doing this work. So, and I know it's like economics are weird too. And so if you are someone who's looking for restorative work or thinking about how to infuse liberation into your work, we'd love to have a conversation about that. And even, outside of the, like, whether or not our organization exists or not, I hope that I'm in this work because it's an act of solidarity. I want to change the way that we operate at work. And so I hope that people will be open to how can they lean into more restorative, reciprocal relationships and the ways that they operate at work, because I think it makes work environments where everyone can truly thrive, right? Like, we talk about how can we infuse and seed liberation at work. One of the hardest things about my job is I often am talking to other Black women and they're telling me stories that I've heard many times before and I've experienced many times before, and these work environments are not working for us. And so this work, I would love for people to just be open to letting go of these traditional practices that don't work for us, so that everyone can truly, because work is such a big part. We've decided that we must work so that we can eat, right? And since, this is what we've decided to do to share resources on the planet, might we do it in a way where everyone can thrive?
Amen. Oh my gosh. And could you share, like, website or like newsletter sign up or the courses, anything like that?
Yeah, our website is www.theequitypractice.com. And you can sign up for our newsletter there, and we'll be sharing our courses and our new offerings coming up. And then on social media, I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm trying to be better about sharing some ideas and whatnot there. I would say go to LinkedIn. My Twitter is mainly me talking about things like succession and married at first sight and things like travel. So less, probably more weird, but probably less about liberation there. But on my LinkedIn, I talk a lot about restorative work and liberation and things like that. So be sure to follow me there as well.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Alli. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. And I'll definitely
thank you for having
follow
me.
you on LinkedIn and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Ryan. It's been fun.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Before you go, we wanted to let you know that our spring cohort of the Next Economy MBA begins on March 26th. If you're an entrepreneur seeking to create a business that works for all life, a member of a team looking to transition your organization into one that is more regenerative and democratic, or someone who's considering a career or livelihood transition in embodiment with your values, we designed this course for you. Over this 9-month learning journey, you'll have the chance to learn practical skills around business and life design based on our work with over 250 social enterprises. In addition to live sessions, you can deepen your experience and practice with special sessions, affinity groups, and connections with over 500 alumni who have participated in the course. Interested in learning more? Visit lifteconomy.com/MBA to view our course curriculum and sign up for a free intro with one of our facilitators. If you're ready to sign up, you can use the code PODCASTMBA to save 10% on tuition. We hope you'll join us.